thanks, Laura. First of all, I want to commend you all for joining this webinar. I know that kilns aren't the most exciting things to talk about, but they can get very exciting when things don't go right. I'm sure a lot of you have been rushing to get a kiln repair guy out there when things go wrong, or kilns aren't working. So hopefully we can get you all in tip-top shape so you are handling all these issues before they become big issues. So what we're going to go over today is how to set up your kiln room so it's safe and efficient, loading. There's a lot of things about loading that can really affect how the kiln fires. Programming, managing maintenance and repairs, which is a big one. New products, features to help you manage your business. We'll talk about a little bit about Kiln Link and a new touchscreen that we have coming out with that might help you run the business a little better. Okay, so we'll start with the real boring stuff. For those of you who might be opening a new business, you're going to have to purchase a kiln, and sometimes that can be a little daunting because a lot of the terminology is electrical stuff that you may or may not have dealt with before. But the two biggest things we see is when people order kilns, they might buy them on eBay or buy them from a company that might not know a lot about kilns because they sell gym floors and stuff too. But the two things that you got to get right are your voltage and your phase. Now, in your home, everybody has 240 volts or 208 volts. I mean, only 240 volts. But in your business, you can have 240 volts or 208 volts. And we have to design the kiln specifically for that voltage. A lot of appliances like electric dryers and stuff, they can run on a wide range of voltage. But because we're asking kilns to do so much, we have to design them specifically for that voltage. So if you don't know the voltage, you might want to get an electrician out there before you actually place the order. Phase
hey,
is a little more.
Mike,
yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I've got a comment here. If you could speak up just a little bit.
Okay, is that better?
That is much louder for me. Thank you.
Okay. So phase is a little more confusing, but basically if you look at outlets that might be in the room, if they have 4 holes in there, that means that you have 3-phase. And you either have single phase or 3-phase. In your home, you only have single phase. So if you're buying a kiln on eBay from somebody who ran it in their home, you could get in trouble if it's 3-phase. If you order the wrong kiln, it's very expensive to change it. And then the last thing is amperage as far as electricity goes. Amperage is basically the amount of power that you have available in your fuse box. If all, you got a big air conditioning system, big heater system, a lot of lights, and you're running a bunch of other things, it could be an issue. And so it's always a good idea to get an electrician out there and kind of analyze the situation before you get started. Receptacles we already kind of talked about as far as the kiln, 3-phase or single phase. Make sure you put the receptacle in the right spot because it can be very expensive to move it if you want the kiln in a different spot, and the kiln cord is only 6 feet long. As far as other receptacles, you're going to need a receptacle for your vent system. We sell the EnviroVent 2, which is 120 volts, and all downdraft vents are 120 volts, I believe. But we'll talk more about venting later. If you're going to run Kiln Link, the current design requires an additional 120 volt outlet. And sometimes if you don't have adequate ventilation to keep the room cool, you might want to get some additional like box fans in there, so you might need a few more outlets for that. And if you're going to use Kiln Link, you're going to need an internet port or Ethernet port to connect your kiln to the internet. And we'll talk more about that later. Okay, clearances are real important, not only from a safety aspect, but also from a code aspect. If you're getting inspected, if you ever have a fire, they're going to really look at whether or not this thing was stalled up to electrical codes and building codes. And one of the codes in there is their proper clearance between the kiln and any combustible wall or material. And UL requires us to have the kilns 18 inches from any combustible wall. Obviously, you don't want to fire your kiln with newspaper on top of it. But another thing you need to be concerned about is if you open a door when you're firing and you might have some loose papers sitting around and a breeze were to blow one of those papers up against the kiln, it could start a fire. So the outside of the kiln gets up to 600 degrees, which, paper ignites at, I believe, 454. So make sure you don't have any, especially if you have a lot of air movement around there, you don't have combustible materials that can blow into the kiln. And like I said, the kiln band gets really hot, and when your employees are really busy, especially if there's other things stored in that room, they might not be paying attention, and they could accidentally brush up against the kiln, and it could burn them. So it may be a good idea to paint some safety stripes so they have more of a sense of the clearance that they need to keep from the kiln. And we mentioned the combustible materials. The floor covering by code needs to be a non-combustible surface, concrete, ceramic tile. Most schools have vinyl composition tile, and that hasn't been a problem. But if you have an old building that might have a wood floor, you definitely need to make some changes. And one thing you can do is just go down to Home Depot or Home Base, wherever you have there, and buy some 2-inch concrete pavers. And they're usually like 1 foot square. And if you put those down on the floor and the perimeter extends at least 12 inches beyond the perimeter of the kiln, then you'd be up to code. Definitely do not put a kiln on carpet. We had somebody do that in the past. If you ever have any questions about your situation, you can always give us a call, and we can walk you through it. Okay, so venting. There's basically 2 reasons you vent. One is to keep the room cool, and we'll talk about why that's important. But the other is to actually improve the environment inside of the kiln, so the kiln fires more evenly, and any combustibles that are coming out of clay or glazes are vented out so they don't interact with the glazes and give you bad results, or the clay bodies. I don't know if many of you have wheel programs where you're actually doing a bisque firing. Most of you are buying bisque and just doing glaze firings. But whenever you fire clay, it burns out all of the combustibles during that firing. And one of the things it's burning out is carbon. And if you don't burn out all of the carbon during your bisque firing, then it wants to come out during your glaze firing, and that's what causes a lot of pinholing, where the carbon is outgassing through the glaze, and it just leaves a little blank spot where there's, well, it just looks like a pinhole in the glaze. It also has some added effects, the downdraft ventilation. It brings some of that that hot air that's rising back to the bottom. Kilns normally fire a little cooler on the bottom. Creates almost like a convection oven where it's mixing that heat around, so the kiln fires more evenly. It also, because you're getting all those fumes out of there that can affect your bands and your elements and your thermocouples, a lot of those fumes attack metal. So if you're actively taking those out instead of just propping your lid, it's not affecting all that metal in your kiln as much. So your elements and bands and stuff will last a lot longer. To have a EnviroVent installed, you're going to have a way of venting it out just like you do your dryer. So ours requires a 3-inch diameter hole, either mostly through an outside wall, or if you have to, if it's an interior room, you might have to go through the ceiling. And a HVAC contractor could help you out with that. If you have 2 kilns, which a lot of you do, you don't have to buy 2 vents. We have a system that you see in the middle picture there that allows you to put in a little Y connection, and you can vent 2 kilns with 1 motor. We also have something called the Enviro Link. A lot of times, since these are run on a toggle switch, which oftentimes is really hard to get to behind the kiln, if you get an Enviro Link, every time you press start, the vent will automatically come on. And I think those are around $100. They're not too expensive. And you do have to run a wire back to your controller because it runs off of the controller. Okay, so room ventilation, this is where the HVAC people come in. You have to vent your room either through air conditioning or an open window or fans so that the kiln room stays below 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Number one, 100 degrees is pretty uncomfortable for your employees to be working in. But number two is, if the kiln room gets over 105 degrees, the controller is actually, or the back side of the controller inside of the box is getting much hotter than that because it's also getting the heat from the kiln. And if it gets above 160 degrees, it'll shut the kiln off and you'll get a message that says EBD. And that just means that, hey, the controller was getting too hot, and because we didn't want to damage it, we shut down your firing. If that happens, then you know you're right at the limit or maybe way over the limit of not having adequate ventilation in the room. If you have to get through the firing, sometimes just putting a box fan facing on the side of the controller will keep it cool enough to get you through. But eventually you're going to have to figure out how to get more air movement into that room so it's not constantly shutting down on you. A lot of if you bring in a heating, cooling, and ventilation contractor, they'll want to know the BTU rating of the kiln. And if you call us, we can give that to you. Okay, so sprinklers, a lot of commercial buildings have fire sprinklers in them. If you have one right above the kiln, especially in a room with a low ceiling, it is very easy to set one of those off. The good news is they make different temperature rating fuses that go in these things. The lowest one is 132 degrees, and that's pretty standard. I believe the color is red. They're all color-coded. If you do have one under there or over the top of your kiln, you might want to do a test fire, get a thermometer, cheap thermometer down at Home Depot, tape it to the ceiling, and see how close you're getting to that temperature. If it's getting close, rather than setting off the sprinklers, it's a pretty good idea to get your fire sprinkler contractor in there and get a different temperature fuse in there. A lot of times the fire department or the inspector from the fire department is going to want to get involved in that as well. Racks for storage. Like I said, the kilns get very hot, so if your employees are in and out of there a lot, make sure that you have adequate space so they can get what they need, get out of the kiln without getting too close to the kiln. It's a good idea to keep your kiln room clean. All the dust that can develop in these rooms, especially if you leave your lids open all the time, if that dust settles on the kiln elements, it significantly reduces the life of the elements, which is why one of the reasons we recommend vacuuming your kiln on occasion, and we'll talk about that. Okay, kiln loading. A lot of kilns get beat up by having untrained employees loading the kiln. It's money well spent to take time training your employees how important it is not to knock the kiln shelves into the side of the kiln and break out the brick. If you show them how to load properly, you'll get more in the kiln because you'll have less inefficient space in there. You'll have proper clearances, so people didn't slide a bowl over into the elements and burn out the element and ruin the bowl. For people, especially the people who are firing bisque, I'm sure it's important with the glaze too. Make sure their hands are clean. Don't go to have them go eat a bunch of Popeye's chicken and then load the kiln with greasy fingers, because all of that will affect your glazes and your bisque. And some of these shelves are quite heavy, and it's hard to get them into the bottom of the kiln. So teach them how to lift things properly, and make sure that they're comfortable loading the shelf, especially into the bottom of the kiln. And make sure they're aware that that lid brace is holding an 80-pound lid above their heads in many cases. And if they're not careful and they hit the lid brace with their elbow, that lid can come down on their head, and it's happened before and it hurts. So be careful of that. Okay, so before you load the kiln, check your shelves to make sure that there's no bare spots. And by bare spots, I mean areas where the kiln wash had come off of the shelf. Because if you have any glaze run off a piece onto that bare spot, then that pot will become fused to the shelf. And you'll have to break it off and then grind the shelf. So always inspect your kiln wash. If it's getting kind of old and bumpy and cracky and there are lots of bare spots, then it's time to just take a wire brush to it and a sponge and get as much of the old stuff on and put new coating on. If you're using stilts, over time the little pieces of metal are they're just like your elements. They oxidize and they become weak, and especially if you try to high fire them, which we don't recommend, they can start laying down. So if pieces aren't sitting on there evenly, like if one of the points is laid down, they could fall over during the firing. Look at your element grooves. Make sure you don't have little bits of glaze or chunks of brick or anything sitting on the elements, because if you do, that piece can burn through the oxidation layer on the element and cause the element to break, which is another good argument for vacuuming on a regular basis. Check your thermocouple. If somebody hit it with a shelf the last time they loaded it, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and just replace it. They're not expensive. I think they're like $15. Over time, they oxidize. If you look at the picture in the middle, the one on the right is it's about at the end of its life. But you can monitor how much life you have left in your thermocouple, because as they age, they start working towards an overfire towards the very end of their life, which is why you should use a witness cone, and we'll talk more about that. If you have a witness cone next to your thermocouple on every firing, and you're keeping a firing log, always write down how did the cone look. If it's sitting down on the shelf, that's a good indication that you're going to have to replace that thermocouple soon. You want to keep a kiln log not only to monitor your thermocouple, but if you have one employee coming in the next day, if they can look at the kiln log and the other employee unloaded the kiln, noticed that there was an error message, or things didn't really come out well on the bottom, or wherever you might have a relay out, and it's just a wasted firing to load it again and fire it when things aren't working correctly. Excessive firing times. Firing for a glazed firing should take about 7.5 hours. If you're getting up to like 12 hours, it's a pretty good indication that your elements are going, or you possibly have a relay that needs to be replaced. For those of you who are using high fire clay, it's very important that you do not mix the low fire clay in with those loads, because when you fire low fire clay, and by low fire I mean like the 04, 06 clay that you normally would use in a program such as yours, high fire clay would be, or mid-range or high fire would be, cone 5, 6, up to 10. If you fire the low fire clay with the high fire clay, the low fire clay will melt and probably ruin your kiln. Okay, so clearances are real important. It's important to post up at least 1 inch from the bottom of the kiln. Never fire stuff right on the bottom. Number one, you'd probably be blocking your vent holes, so your vent wouldn't be working. But number two is that if you fire things directly on the bottom of the kiln, which we call the slab, it's going to suck the heat out of that piece. So everything that you fire on the bottom will be underfired. By posting up 1 inch, you let one of the elements radiate underneath the kiln, so it kind of heats that shelf. Keep 1 inch from the side. So every time you load a layer of wear in there and shelves, get in the habit of looking around and make sure you have 1 inch clearance from the elements all the way around before you load another one. Because if you load the whole kiln and then see you got a bowl on the bottom, you got to unload the whole kiln to move that bowl over. Keep shelves and wear at least 2 inches from the thermocouple. These things, anytime you put mass near a thermocouple, the kiln's going to think it's firing cooler than it actually is, and you run the risk of overfiring. Keep wear at least 2 inches from the lid. You can see from that picture that somebody had their wear right up near the lid. A lot of people think that, well, if I put a straight edge across the top and it's not touching anything, I'm golden. But that's not true, because your lid actually becomes a little convex as it heats up, because the inside expands more than the outside, and it'll actually drop down a little bit into the kiln chamber and can grab pots like you see in that picture. It also can run really cool right up near the lid because there's no heat being radiated down from the lid. And then allow enough room between shelves to allow at least one element groove to radiate between the shelves. So this is not usually a factor unless you're doing ceramic tile, something really flat, or maybe plates. Generally you want to post up a minimum of 2 inches so you can get at least one element groove radiating in between the shelves. Okay, so density concentration is real important when you're loading the kiln. A lot of times, especially if you haven't loaded a kiln and you're not familiar how everything's going to fit in there, people generally load the bottom really heavy because they want to make sure they're going to get everything in, or they realize they're not going to get everything in and they load the top real heavy. And those are the two places you do not want to load it heavy. Anywhere you load the density in a concentration, it's going to take a little longer for that to heat up, so it tends to underfire. So you want to spread that density out. And one good way to get an idea of how your kiln is going to load is take your wear carts and before you load the kiln, just put the pieces on cut out pieces of cardboard that are the shape of your kiln or your kiln shelf. And that way you know that when the piece of cardboard is filled up, that's one shelf load. And it also is helpful if you arrange them by height. That way you don't get in a position where you're putting a plate next to a vase, because all of that space above that plate is wasted space. Okay, so there's a lot of reasons why we use self-supporting witness cones. Boy, I have a bunch of spelling errors in here. We talked about the most important one is to monitor your thermocouple, but they can also monitor the uniformity of the heat in the kiln. So if you put a cone on every shelf and you find that maybe the bottom shelf is firing a little cool, then and that's all determined by the cone bend. You can see on the chart on the right, anything from a 20 degree down to just above touching the shelf is good enough for everything that we're doing. But if you get in a situation where you don't get a cone bending at all, then you might want to put like a 5-minute hold on the end of the firing. If you're using cone fire mode, that's the last question it's going to ask you. And that gives the bottom kind of time to catch up with the rest of the kiln. If it's constantly having that problem, you could have an issue where you need a new bottom element or a relayout. But you can also address that problem by loading that area less dense. Anywhere where you find, by looking at your witness cone, that it's firing too cool, if you load it less dense, it'll fire a little hotter. So you have some ways to adjust. Okay, so if you learn anything from this presentation, the two things that will save you the most are letting you know from all of our experience in technical support how people have ruined their kilns. The number one, and we kind of talked about this, is accidentally putting in cone 06 instead of, or cone 6 instead of 06. Cone 6 is way hotter than 06. And if you're not firing any high fire or mid-range clay, you're just firing 06, 04, 05, 06, I would suggest that you go into the menu option and there's a place where you can set the max programmable temperature. So you could set it so none of your employees could fire the kiln over cone 04. So that takes away that issue, or the potential for that issue. If you put in cone 6, you're going to melt all the low fire clay in your kiln. The second one is, a lot of people, especially if they just ate lunch and heated up a burrito in the microwave, if you look at a microwave, if you put 5.00 in there, that's 5 minutes. On your kiln, let's say you wanted to put that 5-minute hold at the top of the firing. If you put 5.00 in there, that's 5 hours. And if you hold at peak temperature for 5 hours, you're going to way overfire everything in the kiln. So those are the two ways that if you're going to train your employees of two things that they have to be terrified about, those would be the two things. And as Laura mentioned, we have videos on all of this stuff that I'm talking to you about. If you go to skutt.com, click on resources, videos, you can scroll through all the videos on loading, programming, troubleshooting, repair. There's a lot of videos that are really useful. Okay. Firing logs can help you monitor. I'm going to pick this up a bit because I know that it's getting later. You can download these firing logs from our website. One is to record the results of the firing, and the other is a maintenance log. And maintenance is one of the most important things that you can monitor, because when your kilns are down, you're losing money. Customers are getting upset because their stuff is taking longer. And depending on where you are, it can be very difficult to get a kiln repair person out to repair your kiln in a timely fashion. Okay. The things you want to monitor are like the number of times, number of firings between repairs. That way it'll give you an indication as to when you might expect to have to replace that item again. So if your relays lasted 200 firings before and you're on your 199th firing since then, you might want to consider trying to organize with your kiln repair person to say, hey, my relays are going to have to be replaced soon. When you replace things like relays, elements, replace them all at once. They have similar lives. So you're just going to have to pay that guy or woman 2 weeks later to come out and do it again, and it's going to cost you more money in the long run. Okay, when you're looking for kiln repair people, ideally you'd like someone who's trained in the factory. So we offer our distributors' employees kiln training for repairs. I know Paragon does the same thing. I'm not sure about the other kiln companies, but if they're factory trained, that is a pretty good indication that they know what they're doing. If you have a guy who is doing it part-time and says, oh, well, my brother was an electrician, I've gone into places where they use parts that aren't rated for the temperatures and the amperage that we need, and they become an unsafe situation. So it's real important that you find a good repair person. And if you need help with that, you can call our tech support guys. They know them all, and they have a list. In some areas, we're just not going to have a good one, and you might have to find a handyman or an electrician to work on your kiln, or learn on how to work on it yourself. And like I said, you want to schedule these things in advance, not right before your busiest day. It's good to be very proactive with kiln repair. It'll pay off in the long run, believe me. When you're not firing, you're not making money, and your customers are getting upset. If you're going to stock parts, I would stock the elements that fit your kiln, the relays, and the thermocouples. A lot of times the repair person might not have those available, and then he's got to wait for them to come in, and he doesn't want to pay, for express delivery. So, just getting the parts sometimes can take a week. So, if you have them in stock and say, hey, just come on down, I got the parts, you put them in. Things that you can do yourself, that you should be doing yourself: watch the video on replacing thermocouples. It takes 5 minutes. It's really easy. If you put the thermocouple in backwards, you'll get an error message, so it'll tell you if you do it wrong. The key to it is just make sure everything's nice and tight when you put it in there, and the thermocouple's in the right way. You can watch the video to see how it's done correctly. Vacuum out your kilns. You can get twice the life out of your elements if you vacuum out your kilns. I think we suggest like every 30 firings or every 30 days, but the more the better. Tighten your bands. Everything that's connected to your kiln is connected to the bands that wrap around the brick. The brick offers no support at all. They're very soft brick. And if your bands are loose, then everything hanging off your kiln is loose, and especially things like your lid brace can be a safety hazard. So you tighten them in the back of the kiln. We have a video on that as well, so watch that video. You could save a lot of money and a lot of downtime, if you learn how to replace relays. Anytime you work on a kiln, the kiln should be unplugged. So there's no risk of electrocution. If you have any trouble or are apprehensive at all, our technicians can walk you through it. We have a video on replacing relays. Same with elements. Okay, so the 10 things that will make your kiln last longer: train your employees. If they're breaking out the brick all the time, you're going to have to get a new kiln every 2 years or 3 years. Vacuum out your elements. Elements will last longer. Tighten your bands. If you do break out a lip that holds the element in, those elements are going to want to droop out. So we generally don't recommend you replace your brick until it's time to replace the element. So in order to get by that period, if you look at the picture next to the guy with the pot to his face, you can use element pins and build a little fence to keep that element in there. And then when the element is finally worn out and it's time to change the elements, you can change the brick. It's much easier to wait till then. Those are not paper clips. Paper clips will melt. They have to be element pins. They're the same material that the elements are made out of. Use only qualified kiln repair people. It's amazing the damage that an unqualified person can do to your kiln. If you don't have to high fire, don't high fire. A set of elements might last 80 firings if you're going to cone 6. They'll last closer to 400 to 500 if you're just low firing and you're doing everything else like venting and vacuuming out your elements. Keep the kiln room below 100 degrees. Heat, especially for the relays. The relays don't like being exposed to a lot of heat, so they'll last much longer. Fire only dry wear. If you have a wheel program and you're firing, you're doing bisque firings, a lot of people think they can use their kiln as a dryer, and Either you're going to blow up the pots in there, but you're also, all that moisture that's coming out of the clay body is going to attack your bands and your elements, anything metal in the kiln. Kind of a trick to see if things are, all the water's out of a pot is hold it up to your cheek. If it feels cool, it's still got moisture in it. Use a downdraft vent. If you don't have a downdraft vent, you're going to have to prop the lid 2 inches until the kiln gets to 1,000 degrees on your bisque firing, and then remember to come back and lower it. And all of that heat and fumes are running across your bands. So a downdraft vent will help your kiln last longer. And then one thing that most people don't know about is if you get a new set of elements in your kiln, you want to fire it empty. If you load it full of stuff that's going to gas out onto the elements, you're going to affect the formation of the oxide layer that it develops during that first firing. So you want to fire it up to cone 04 empty, and then you build a nice clean layer, and that layer will protect the element throughout its entire life. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly talk about Kiln Link, and then we'll wrap it up. Kiln Link is a way, it's kind of a system for monitoring your kiln. It has areas, it's basically connecting your kiln to the internet. And it's like you have your own kiln page up there. It logs all of your firings. If you want our technicians to look at the logs, look at the diagnostics, we can look at it and tell you exactly what's going on your kiln. So if you call us up and say, hey, my kiln's not firing right, Perry or Daniel can pull up your kiln and say, okay, well, it looks like your amperage is low on the bottom section. I think we need to replace that bottom element or whatever. We can tell a lot by looking at these diagnostics. Also, you can set it up for alerts. So it can alert you when the kiln has dropped to, let's say, 125 degrees, and you're not wasting time unloading that kiln. You can turn that kiln quicker. It'll also send you a text alert if there's an error message that shuts down the kiln. So you know you have to go deal with that. If the kiln shut off and got an error 1, instead of having this wasted time where you didn't know the kiln wasn't firing, you can be proactive and start getting on the issue. I told you about the max temperature setting. The kiln also now monitors the number of firings, total firings, which is helpful in diagnostics if you don't have Kiln Link. It also will monitor the cost of the firing. All you have to do is set it up. You have to put what you pay per kilowatt hour and you can find that on your bill. And then after every firing, it'll say, oh, well, this firing cost $8. And that way you can monitor your costs a little better. And then all of our kilns, if you have a green LED display, then you have built-in diagnostics. And our technicians can just have you press a few buttons, and we can tell what the amperage and the voltage readings are, which tells us quite a bit. So here's what the Kiln Link page looks like. We're going to come out with a new version that's a little more user-friendly. It doesn't look so much like you're firing some industrial kiln. But if you want to know more about Kiln Link, feel free to call us. We can send you information. There's plenty of stuff on our website as well. So that is all I had. I know it was a lot. And,
that's all you have, really? That is amazing. That was so much information. I usually have questions myself here, but I'm just, I think, in overwhelmed stage. I think I could come to work, tomorrow for Skutt. But you guys do so much, and I think one of the biggest takeaways I think for our studios is the 10 ways to, to save your kiln here. I think top 10 things that'll make it last longer. I think that is what every studio on here needs to take away from here. And you guys, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in here, and we'll get them answered very quickly. One of the things that the CCSA, Dean and myself, neither of us own a studio nor ever have. But one of the things that I see, I see a lot of vacuums, like shop vacs next to kilns when I'm in a studio. Is there anything that you guys recommend over something else to vacuum
anything
the kiln?
that can get in there, a vacuum with a hose attachment works just fine. Shop vacs are nice because they have really heavy suction, and they usually have that little brush attachment on there. But one thing that you need to be careful of is the hose is usually plastic, and when you move particles through it, it creates a little static. So be careful not to touch the hose to your thermocouple, because that could send that static shock right up to your controller and knock out one of the electronic components on it.
There's a couple of studio owners here, and I know in my area, and I know they both vacuum their kilns on a very regular basis. I mean, that one step, what do you think that takes? Like 5 minutes? 10 minutes?
It depends on how fast you vacuum.
Yeah, exactly.
To be honest, I've never vacuumed out a kiln. But
have you ever vacuumed?
Take, 5 minutes, tops. It doesn't take that long.
Yeah, and just to put that on your log. Sorry.
There's a question on our resource page. I believe it's under miscellaneous items. Under printed, there's a top navigation that once you get to resources, go to printed, and then I believe it's under miscellaneous to find the kiln logs.
All right. I think we might actually have them as well. I'll look as well on our site. I think at some point we put them up on our log as well.
We do have a document for band tightening. If it's not on our website under printed maintenance, give us a call or send an email to mike@skutt.com, and I'll send it to you. There's also a video that you should find under resources and videos for tightening bands.
And I know one of the things that we do have on our website that you guys gave to us is designing a kiln room, which is really helpful for a lot of our newer members. So
yeah, you can just give it to your contractor or the architect, whoever you're working with, and that gives them all the information they need to put it all in the right place. A lot of contractors think they know about what a kiln needs, but they're very unique animals, so it tends to throw them off, and they can make decisions that can waste a lot of time and cost a lot of money to change.
I think under I'm on your website right now, under the manuals, I saw some things about, where did I see, thermocouples and other things for different kinds of documents that you guys have about doing your own repairs on here as well. So
yeah.
Tons of great information.
I'm embarrassed at the layout of our website. I don't think it's terrible, but we're about ready to kick off in about 2 weeks, we'll have a completely different layout, and it should be hopefully super easy to navigate. The videos are laid out differently, and we'll have a bunch of new information up there for you.
Well, great. And if they can't find it on your website, they can always call in. So we're gonna start wrapping this up. I got just a couple things of housekeeping. Just please, if you're leaving us please make sure you take the survey. That's really helpful. And later this afternoon, you'll receive an email from me that will have a link to the recording and also just the presentation. It is something, I mean, I think this is something that should be in every employee training program. So if you want to save the link and show your employees or make them watch the video and look through it, I think that would definitely be a great thing. So look for that this afternoon. And if you guys have any questions, Mike, they can email you. Is that the best way to get in touch with you?
Sure. Yeah, just Mike
Okay.
at skutt.com.
All right. And Mike, thank you so much. This is so informative. You have no idea how much I learned here. So thank you very much for joining us today and doing this for us. We greatly appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great day. Finish your survey. Look for your email this afternoon. And go vacuum your kiln now that you're all inspired. Take care, everyone. Thanks again, Mike.